Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending where you're at. My name is Erwin Figueroa. I am the Director of Organizing and Transportation Alternatives. I want to thank you all for attending our Vision Zero Series conference. Before I begin and I introduce our keynote speaker, I want to emphasize that Transportation Alternatives is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and that Transportation Alternatives does not support or oppose any candidate for public office. Our next speaker is an individual that I've been particularly impressed by in a number of ways. One of them is his efforts to center transportation policy along the intersectional nature of transportation, along other issues that are prevalent in communities of color, as well as addressing it as a social justice issue. Communities of color in urban environments have suffered from physical segregation by the way of train tracks, boulevards, and highways that have served suburban populations at the expense of the health and well-being of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Secondly, as we look into the future of transportation, ensuring that equity and sustainability of transit-oriented developments to combat climate change, address health outcomes, and bridge the gap in terms of wages and in terms of funding that is dedicated for communities of color is also important. And then last but not least, representation at the federal level from communities of color on transportation issues is important as we move forward in a country and society that is more just and more equitable for everyone that lives by, and that transportation is not something that is leaving people behind as we create a better country for everyone. With all that said, I want to introduce Congressman Jesús Chuy Garcia, who represents the Illinois 4th District. It is his first term in the House of Representatives, where he serves on the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure. Last year, Representative Garcia co-sponsored the Vision Zero Act of 2019, which will provide federal funding to help local communities to develop and carry out Vision Zero plans and improvements. Representative Garcia co-founded the Future Transportation Caucus in the House, which aims to promote equity, access, and sustainability, and has been a leading voice, advancing equitable transit-oriented development, transit parity, and challenges to the status quo of transportation policies. He holds a master's in urban planning and policy from the University of Illinois in Chicago. So please, join me in providing a warm welcome to Congressman Jesús Chuy Garcia. Congressman.
Great. Thank you, Erwin, for that wonderful introduction, and good afternoon. Thank you for tuning in today. I'm thrilled to be joining Transportation Alternatives for the 6th Annual Vision Zero Cities Conference. The topics you'll discuss and the exchange of ideas throughout the conference are an important part of our collective work to save lives, make our streets safer, and our movement to break down the barriers to more equitable and sustainable mobility. My name is Jesús Chuy Garcia, and I hail from America's Gold Coast, AKA Chicago. I represent Chicago's 4th Congressional District, which spans the northwest and southwest sides of the city, and it's connected by a series of suburbs, mostly working class. I've spent my years fighting for social and economic justice, and I've also studied urban planning at the University of Illinois in Chicago. In what now seems like a streak of good luck, I joined the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, where I've been able to bring those worlds together. It isn't said enough, but transportation policy is more than just buses, trains, and highways. In fact, transportation policy is just as much a social justice issue as education, criminal justice reform, and healthcare, but perhaps in an even more concrete way, no pun intended. From physical barriers that separate communities to policies that limit mobility to those with the financial ability to own and maintain a personal vehicle. Social and economic justice go hand in hand with the decisions of local partners and departments of transportation. I also sit on the Committee on Natural Resources, where we focus on the environment, as well as on the Committee of Financial Services, which oversees the critical housing policy. It's the perfect synergy when it comes to thinking about transformational transportation policy. But before we get into how we can and should reimagine our approach to transportation reform, let's talk about the basics of Vision Zero. As I said, I am from the Windy City, the birthplace of the labor movement and the modern day labor movement, thanks to the Pullman workers. We're a city of big immigrants who hail from every corner of the world, and a city filled with pride in our rich history and diversity. That said, we, like so many cities, are afflicted with constant tragedies caused by car accidents, or more accurately, predictable and preventable occurrences. Vision Zero plans are being implemented in large, medium, and small towns throughout the country, thanks to the leadership of so many of this at this conference today. In fact, in Chicago, we launched our Vision Zero initiative in 2017, when at the time, 2,000 people were dying in Chicago every year. Over 10,000 a year were being seriously injured. The numbers were staggering and tragic, and they still are. One death, as we know, is too many. But before I get into a meaty discussion about the direction of where our federal government is going and where we could be going, we cannot fail to acknowledge how much the 2020 coronavirus has upended life as we knew it. Most relevant to our discussion, of course, is the fact that data will skew oddly in 2020, given the lockdowns that occurred throughout the past 7 months. More importantly, however, we must take pause to recognize and mourn the over 220,000 Americans who have perished. In contrast to car crashes, the coronavirus pandemic is now the third leading cause of death in America, just behind heart disease and cancer. As I'm sure many of you have felt in your respective professions, these grim realities have sent shockwaves into governments at every level. The result, many of our policy priorities and projects were sidelined. Just this year, we spent weeks fighting tooth and nail just to keep public transportation agencies afloat with an infusion of funds. Like in other cities, many in Chicago rely on the L trains, some of you call them subways, and CTA buses to get to work, especially our essential workforce like the doctors and nurses on the front lines of this pandemic. But the truth is, there is some silver lining. As we begin to consider a changing political landscape, along with the dramatic ways in which COVID has changed our lives day to day, the things that we took for granted, we also have a great opportunity to usher in transformative change. A wide open door to push for transportation alternatives, and a wide open door to a society more willing than ever to adapt and change old habits and trends. In order to save lives and make our streets safer, we need to take a holistic approach. It's more than bike infrastructure, crosswalks, or better intersection design and planning. I'm preaching to the choir, of course, but in order to truly achieve zero roadway deaths, we must make transformational changes, not changes in the margins, This means rethinking the systems that incentivize long-distance commutes and the ownership of a car. It means rethinking how we zone and plan entire communities around access and mobility. Who has the access to community resources? What are the options to get to school, work, or leisure? Are transportation alternatives safe and accessible for all? Can those who afford a car afford to live close enough to viable public transportation routes? And by that, I meant those who cannot afford a car. In order to tackle these more macro questions, it is often our gut reaction to say, we need more money. If we only had a larger budget line, we could complete more projects and address these systemic shortfalls. But case study after case study shows us that throwing more money at the problem doesn't always make it go away. That principle applies to transportation and infrastructure as well. For example, addressing congestion on Avenue A, which may contribute to roadway crashes in the city, might include spending lots of money to widen or build an alternative roadway to give cars other routes. The result, however, may be induced demand and an increase in road crashes. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we don't need more money, because we do. But the long story is achieving our Vision Zero aims will take a full court press on multiple fronts and a holistic approach to transportation policy. It will take smarter, bolder investments. It will take zoning and planning changes. It will mean investing in transit-oriented development, and it will mean a lot of political obstacles and delays. More than anything, it will require the courage to tackle the status quo, including funding formulas otherwise considered untouchable for many, many decades. I know that one of the reasons I was invited to join this week's conference was to share one helpful fact. Rest assured, some in Congress and our federal government get it. And we are growing in numbers, and it looks like we'll be joined by more who get this point in the 117th Congress. My staff said some of you might know the term NUMTOT, which I'm told is short for New Urbanist Memes for Transit-Oriented Teens. All I know is some of the work we've done in the House garnered the attention of those called NUMTOTs, which, as I understand it, means we are on the right track. What they may have noticed is that I helped launch a new group in the 116th Congress entitled the Future of Transportation Caucus. Our mission is to promote equity, access, and sustainability in our transportation policies at the federal level and fundamentally challenge the status quo. Among our ranks are my co-founders, Congressman Mark Takano from the West Coast of California, and Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley from the East Coast of Massachusetts. Right now, we are 32 strong and we're growing, and we intend to keep on growing. From advancing efforts to prioritize maintenance and repair over new capacity projects to addressing the antiquated metric of level of service, we are throwing sand into the gears of a policy space that has been on autopilot for too long. This past Congress, the House successfully passed one of the most transformative surface transportation bills we have seen in decades. In it, we included the major components of the Complete Streets Act to advance Vision Zero targets, as well as historic changes to policy, a new greenhouse gas emission performance metric at the federal level, new metrics to calculate access beyond just speed. We begin to take into account congestion, road stress, and alternatives to driving. We establish an Office of Transit supportive communities to focus on transit-oriented development. And we are working to ensure that transit-oriented development is a force for good, not gentrification. The House legislation even included bipartisan language I authored to promote a fix-it-first approach to prioritize maintenance over new capacity projects that we know can often create induced demand. Of course, these efforts stalled in the Senate, but we're making strides in conventional thinking by educating and acclimating members of Congress to alternatives to our current status quo. This past year, we also began seeding the idea that traditional 80-20 split between transit and highway funding inherently sustains inequity and limits mobility and opportunity for working class and low-income families. It especially disadvantages communities of color. The viability of transportation alternatives, including biking, walking, and public transportation, is constantly shortchanged by funding practice and set of performance metrics rigged to favor roads and highways. In Congress, too few members have a nuts and bolts understanding of our transportation system. As a result, fail to question current policies and formulas. We want to change that. Long accepted as a non-controversial issue area, federal transportation and infrastructure policy in Congress is largely governed by a small number of insiders. We want to change that. A practice where policies and top-line funding levels are tweaked and reauthorized every few years without any fundamental reconsideration or analysis. We want to change that. The Future of Transportation Caucus seeks to challenge that and force Congress to take a hard look at what works and what doesn't work. And perhaps more importantly, where is all that money going, and is it achieving the outcomes we want to see? If not, what are we doing to adapt? Imagine a system that boasted transit parity, a system that gave transit just as much money as it does highways. Imagine the kind of transit systems and alternatives we could provide constituents. The frequency of service improvements, reach, ridership, safety. Imagine a move towards more mixed-use projects supported by federal funding aimed to promote more transit-oriented development. Instead of a unilateral focus on fuel efficiency or CAFE standards, it's spelled C-A-F-E, pronounced CAFE standards, or electrifying the fleet. Imagine a stronger focus on taking cars off the road, shortening commutes, and increase transit alternatives. Imagine a system that scrapped level of service and took a more basic approach, asking the question, what gets people from point A to point B in less time, rather than using speed as a metric of success without accounting for congestion or induced demand. All these wish list items aren't just wish lists for many urban planners. They are actually ingredients for simply better public policy. The message I hope you all leave today with is this: the sooner we embrace bold changes and fight for good policies, however tough the political pushback, we can educate, advocate, and advance fundamental reforms that challenge accepted norms and the status quo. The main challenge is getting over our fear that our efforts are in vain. Congress passes billions and billions of dollars in transportation funding each year without even batting an eye when it comes to what policies those dollars fund. We can and must change that, but we must commit. In so doing, we can dramatically move closer towards our Vision Zero aims, save lives, and make our streets safer. In so doing, we can actually reshape our urban, suburban, and even rural landscape. By taking bold stances, we take unheard of ideas and make them mainstream. By posing these challenging questions, we move beyond the shock of challenging the way things have always been to policy discussions about how things can be better. Instead of outright rejecting the notion of transit funding parity with highways, we start to think about what we could achieve. Could trips be shorter? Can we make mobility more affordable and accessible for all? Can we reduce roadway deaths by taking cars off the road instead of telling pedestrians to get a car? No great change has ever come without some challenge to the status quo. To those of you in city planning departments, state or city departments of transportation, know this: you are doing the heavy lifting, and your work and your innovative ideas are not unseen. Your work is not unnoticed. The dysfunctional autopilot that Congress has been on with regards to transportation policy and funding is finally being called out and noticed from within. With the growing Future of Transportation Caucus and the growing consciousness of members of Congress about the ways in which we can reform our transportation policies, the closer we are getting to achieving fundamental changes so that we can promote equity, access, and sustainability and safety, so we can finally bring roadway deaths down to zero. I'm only one voice, but it will take all of us to challenge ourselves, to challenge others, especially our state, local, and federal government, to finally achieve our ambitious but achievable goals. Thank you all for listening in, and know that you have allies in Congress, and we're growing.
Thank you, Congressman Garcia. Please join me in providing a virtual round of applause to the Congressman, and thank you for joining us today. As an organizer, it is encouraging to see an effort to change the status quo on transportation policy at the federal level. No matter which travel mode you use daily, ensuring an equitable, just way to do so for all communities is important. So again, thank you, Congressman, for helping to lead the Future Transportation Caucus, and we're excited to see what holds next for transportation in our country.
Great. Thank you. Good afternoon.
Just as an announcement for our next panel, which will be happening at 5 p.m., it is the vision vignettes, and that will be happening at 5 p.m. It will be Vahid Shamsi from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Kurt Culbertson from the Design Workshop, Sky Duncan from NACTO, Eric Gonzalez from the Kings County Attorney's Office, and Mary Beth Kelly from the Foundation for Safe Streets. Hope to see you all there.